Turn this back on. We're going to crank the volume up because we do have some audio in the show. Get comfortable. We're going to be nice and toasty warm in here. Not a problem at all. And excitedly, we're going to learn how to count not only the people in the room, but we're going to learn how to count crows tonight. So that'll be kind of fun. I got to switch. Let's do this. Fingers crossed that the technology still works, because, you know, sometimes it gets you. Wow. All right, we're good. So thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm really glad to see all of you. And there's some familiar faces here that I've worked with in the past, so it's really great to reconnect with you. And lots of new faces. So I hope we cross paths again. You can find me anytime you like at birddiva.com. My email is really easy to remember too. It's birddiva@gmail.com. And I love tricky questions and I love great stories. So please be in touch as you discover crows and ravens a little bit more deeply after tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about corvids. Am I a corvid expert? Yeah. No. Do I really like birds? Yes. All right. And I love kind of sharing my knowledge and then kind of drawing people in and getting them to think, ask questions, and then trying to find out answers together. So this is what you're going to have a chance to do with me tonight, is learn some of the things that I've learned about crows and ravens, that I'm still trying to learn about crows and ravens, because sometimes they are tricky. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the corvid family, who they are. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the research that's gone into the intelligence of these birds. And there's a really cool foundation for that here in Vermont that some of you might already know about. We're going to talk about crow versus ravens in terms of identifying them. Ravens and crows are actually one of the most misidentified birds on eBird. So if you want to cause Ron less pain and some of the other people that help oversee eBird, absorb some of the tips and tricks that we talk about tonight and kind of boost your ID skills. We're going to have some fun with vocalizations, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Crows in Vermont project that I started. Oh man, it's got to be almost 8 years now that's been around and kicking, and we're trying to, it's just something fun. So we'll finish with that. And I heard you have a pretty good crow roost here in Middlebury, right? So I really want to hear some of your stories as well. So let's start out by talking about who the corvids are. And if you start to think about how some of these birds behave, you'll see some of the different connections. So corvids include crows, ravens, jays, and magpies. I really wish we had magpies here because they're really just so wonderful and unique. Jackdaws, not dogs, and nutcrackers as well. So we have the crows, ravens, and a couple of different types of jays here in Vermont. So there's our little corvid crew. And let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are common to corvids. One of the things that pops up often is about corvids being monogamous. And what I find really interesting about that is we have our own personal feelings about what monogamy is, and the animal world has something entirely different in mind. Okay? So when we think about monogamy in terms of corvids, you can think about being socially monogamous, but genetically promiscuous, which means you're going to get a little something on the side every once in a while, okay? So a brood of crows, a group of them that are born in a year, about 82% of them come genetically from the male, the one male that is paired with the female. So that means there's some other messing around that's happening on the side. So when we think of monogamy, we think that those two are paired, and that's the only pairing that's going to happen. But in order to keep that population genetically diverse, there's a little bit of promiscuity that happens with the corvid family. Corvids are omnivores, so they'll eat just about anything. So we know blue jays will go from fruit to insects to grubs, and we can see that as well in crows. One of the interesting things that I learned is that they're also opportunistic, so they'll be scavengers. But there's one big key with being a scavenger. So what do you think the big thing that needs to happen for a jay or a raven or a crow or this gray jay in order to take advantage of a carcass? What needs to happen? I know you guys are right up front in the graphicness of this, right? Whoa. So what needs to happen? Bing! It has to already be opened up, right? So when we look at the beaks of all the members of our corvid family, they're not like a raptor. They're not designed for ripping and tearing. They don't have the talons to do that. So they need a predator like a coyote or a wolf, hence ravens being very closely associated with wolf packs or coyote packs. So they need that predator to open up the animal, or it's like, yes, they need us to run over it, right? There's a very funny comic online that I almost put in the show that is two crows on the road, and they're talking about a snake that's been tenderized and how they like certain types of tires that make a different texture to the roadkill. So that's another piece, and it's really interesting that Ron mentioned the work that I've done with Otter Creek before in interviewing Jim and some of the rest of you about the Moncton salamander crossing, is when we start to think about how roads chop up habitat, right? They provide food for some animals, but then that also becomes a place where animals can be impacted in terms of roadkill. And all of these guys can be a part of that. All right, what's this crow collecting? Nuts. Acorns. I want you to remember that. And I'm just going to say climate change. And we'll come back to that later. All right, so intelligence with crows. This is kind of fun because we're going to get into some of the cool studies that have been done. And I'm going to read from my notes here because this is all very cerebral. So corvids tend to have a larger hippocampi than other types of birds. Their hippocampus is part of the brain that controls memory, which means they have better spatial memory, which helps with food caching. Anybody know what caching is? Stashing it, right? You know, when you get that really good toy on Christmas, right? I have 3 kids at home, so I know this is happening at our house right now. Get that really good toy, you don't want anybody else to play with it or anybody else to find it, and you're going to stash it somewhere. So corvids do that same sort of thing where they cache food to be able to find it later. And they also do some really amazing things with trying to outwit each other. Ravens will actually fake hide stuff so that the watching ravens won't see where they actually put it when they get to that prime spot for caching the food. So they're very, very smart, and that has to do with their brains. Corvids with larger brains actually have the same amount or more neurons in their forebrain than primates with bigger brains. From the outside, it appears that their brains are very different structurally than a mammalian brain. However, a look inside shows that many of the prominent parts of the corvid forebrain match up with the cortex in mammals. So all of these things play similar roles in terms of cognitive functions, in terms of problem solving, which we're going to look at in just a minute. So this next picture that I accidentally skipped ahead to is of a very special crow. It's from an island in the Pacific. It's called the New Caledonian Crow. And there's been a whole bunch of research that's been done on these crows where they actually are able to use tools. Even crows that have been born in captivity know how to use a tool. And so the ones in the wild use the tools to go into logs and pick out grubs. It's pretty smart. Now when researchers really started to look at the New Caledonian crow and look at how it was different from other crows, they discovered that their eyes are a little bit further forward on their head, and their bill is a little bit straighter and more tapered. So if you think about it, that gives the bird a different perception when it's using that tool, different ability to look and use a tool than other crows. There are some really cool folks that did another study. Sorry, I'm getting my buttons confused here. And for some time, we thought that the New Caledonian Crows were the only ones that had this tool use ability, until another group of researchers started looking at those facial patterns in other birds. And what they found was the Hawaiian crow, which is like an alala, had those same features. And they were very excited about this, and they wanted to go look at this bird and study it in the wild. And it was already extinct. It was gone. It was not in the wild anymore. It was only in captivity. Whew, captivity, great. And they went to the folks who had this bird in the zoo, and they said, we think that this bird is like the New Caledonian Crow, and it can use tools. And everybody at the zoo was like, yeah, we knew that. And they had done all this facial patterning to kind of figure this out. Really kind of fascinating. All right, so some other really cool research. That's from our friend Bern Heinrich. Anybody read some of Bern's books? A Raven in Winter? Yeah, good. Okay, so some really, like, which one?
Bumblebee Economics.
Bumblebee Economics. There's, what's the Winter? Winter World is another really great one. So Bern has done some extensive research on ravens, and what's really amazing, this research that he did showed that ravens have insight, and that means that they have the ability to kind of problem solve without making a misstep. So to be able to look at something and be like, okay, if I do this, this, and this, I'll be able to get that. And then they just do it, right? So he did some research. I think he had 8 different subjects that were in captivity, and he hung a piece of meat on the end of a rope. And most of the crows were able to solve the problem of how to get the meat, which was, do you guys have insight? What do you need to do as a crow to get that piece of meat? I'm watching you at the table here, right? So pull it up, right? But then stand on it, right? And then pull it up again, and then stand on it. So I'm going to pull it up with my beak, and I'm going to stand on it with my foot, and pull it up with my beak, and stand on it with my foot, and pull it up with my beak, and stand on it with my foot. Then I got to get the meat out of the loop on the end of the piece of rope. But they figured this out. Now, who did even better at it?
Ravens?
The first one, the second one, the third one? The second one who was watching. The first one, right? Because they also have the ability to learn from each other, which is part of that intelligence, which is really pretty amazing. So really cool, having insight, performing an action without missteps or much interpretation. All right, have you seen this one? Okay, so here's the crazy thing, and I love this Vermont connection. So John Marsluff studied with Bern Heinrich, and John Marsluff is now in Seattle. And he is part of, there's this really awesome set of researchers out there, a couple that I follow on Twitter and Instagram, and they're just doing some really neat stuff. There's a PBS documentary that was done from his work. So he was looking at the complex social structure, so that ability for crows to be able to almost communicate with each other without communicating, and how the family units kind of work together, how they protected each other, how they communicated across territory together. So this study, what they did is they were looking at the bird's ability to recognize people, to recognize something other than themselves. And so they had 2 sets of researchers who would go out and work with these birds. One researcher would have a certain mask on, and they would go out and trap the birds and band them. How does that feel for a crow? Right? So you're going to remember that through your whole body, okay, as an animal, okay? And you're probably, if you're intelligent, like a crow, you're going to remember who did that, right? And be able to pick them out. So they had people that went out with a certain mask on, and every time you banded a bird, you had to have that certain mask on if you were part of the study. Then they had other people that just went and walked through the area where these birds were, that had other masks on, and didn't do anything, didn't interact with the birds at all. Then they went back 5 years later, and they walked through campus with the mask on of the banding mask, so to speak. Guess what happened? And it's not just one, it's like 2 3, 4, right? And it's not just the ones that they banded, it's other ones. So they learned from each other. So they either learned by watching what had happened, or they learned through some sort of communication about what happened there. So pretty cool. So John Marsluff now has a grad student who's actually studying. Her name is Kaylee Swift. And she is studying, have you heard of crow funerals? Yeah, so this idea that crows mourn their dead. So she's using the same type of mask approach to look at how crows will respond to a person with a fake dead crow, how a crow will respond to a person in the mask with a fake dead crow with a red tail decoy nearby, and how a crow will respond just to a dead crow, and how a crow will respond to the crow and the red-tailed decoy. So she's in the process, that's her PhD thesis right now, to kind of better understand mourning in crows. The idea right now is that crows aren't actually mourning. You see our need to like put people stuff on everybody, right? On all the animals, like this is what they're doing, it's so sad. What do you think they're really doing? Figuring out what's fatal. I'm going to check this whole scene out. Oh my gosh, there's a dead body right here. I'm going to check this whole scene out. I'm going to call everybody else in. We're going to all see what's going on and try to figure that out together. So it may not actually be a mourning, a sadness type of thing. It may actually be a survival thing, and that's what she's looking at right now. So how many of you use Twitter here? Never mind. No. Okay. So, if you use Twitter, or here's a reason to use Twitter. I love that. Vaughn, did you pan the room for that? It was like, I think it was like 3 people. So, Kaylee Smith, who's studying this phenomenon at the University of Washington, every Wednesday she does a game on Twitter called Crow or No Crow. And what she does is she posts images that people send her of different species of crows, or crows or ravens, a corvid that you would mistaken for an American crow, because there are many, many different species. And it's a really fun way to kind of fine-tune your observational skills, and she gives some great tips on how to solve that. Hi, everybody way back there. Thank you for coming. I make eye contact with everybody in the back here this one time. So she's really awesome to follow, and I've learned an awful lot from her. She also has a blog called Corvid Research online that you can read. Okay, I don't know if this is going to work. We're going to try it and see if it'll work. I'm a little scared to ask this next question because so many people did not. So let's see if I can get this to work. So this is a video. Nope. Okay. All right. So you'll have to believe me here. And maybe some of you have seen this. How many of you have Googled? You know what Google is, right? Okay. How many of you have seen the crows sledding in Russia down the roof? Okay, so imagine, I'm going to describe this to you because we can't see the video. So crow finds this like little disc. It almost looks like a metal cap or a plastic cap from something, right? And it's a peaked metal roof and it's covered in snow. And the crow takes the metal disc or the little disc and puts it down and steps on it and slides down the roof. And gets to the bottom and picks the disc up and flies back up to the peak of the roof and does it again. Okay, you think see, now you got to Google this when you get home. Then Google, I think it's all the Russian crows that have fun. There must be something going on there. So there's another video of crows playing in the snow on a car roof. So crows playing in snow, you'll come up with this video of these crows literally getting to the slope on the back window and rolling, like drop the shoulder and roll, okay? So playfulness, we know with our own kids, right, that play is a really important part of learning. And so we see this in the Corvid family as well. And some of you may have witnessed this with the crows in your backyard. If you're fortunate enough to have nesting crows nearby, you're going to see some of these different behaviors. Or when they're flying and they're overhead and they're starting to tumble and play with each other. So that's part of skill building. So we see a lot of playfulness in crows. The other thing that's really fascinating about playfulness and curiosity in the Corvid family is that when crows first fledge, they're really, really curious about things. Neophilia, I think it's called. Liking the new. I really like new things, and I'm going to pick this thing up, I'm going to pick your hat up, and I'm going to check it out, and then I'm going to put it down, and I'm going to pick something else up, and I'm going to throw it, I'm going to play with the disc, right, and I'm going to slide down the roof, okay? So they do that a lot as fledglings, so they can kind of get to know different things in their habitat. But as they mature, it changes. Have you ever tried to get close to a crow? I know, everyone's like, that's not going to work, right? So we get to this place as they mature, they get to a place of neophobia, where they're afraid of new things, and it's a survival thing. So it's this really interesting transition that as they're young, there's that curiosity. We still see playfulness in adults, but as they're young, they're going to play with a lot of different things, and as they get older, they develop this fear of new things. Kelly Swift, who I mentioned before, she was studying ravens in this part of Washington that was away from the ocean. And they were trying to bait the ravens in so that they could tag them. And they scored a giant salmon. And they were like, yes, this is going to be awesome. This is going to be the best thing, right? So we're going to put this fish in the middle of the road, and then we're going to be able to catch the ravens. They're going to come down, and it's going to be awesome. Guess how many ravens they got? 0, because that was not something that was familiar to them as roadkill. I mean, how many fish end up as roadkill? Right? Yeah, you could, maybe during the flood, but so didn't work. But that was a big lesson for them in that neophilia, neophobia kind of thing. All right. So remember the crow with the acorn? I just threw this in here. It doesn't kind of go with the flow of the show, but I find it really fascinating. So there's been some research done about how the Corvid family could possibly be super helpful to us in terms of forest resiliency as we move forward with climate change. So one of the things that is going to happen in New England is our forests are going to change and shift, right? And the tree species are going to start to change and shift. And one of the trees that's really resilient in terms of climate change is the red oak. Now, I work with landowners up in the northern part of Vermont, right along the spine of the Green Mountains, with a group called Cold Holiday Canada. And we go out and plant acorns, and it's really fun, it's social, we have like our little baskets of acorns, but it takes hours, right? We're like, I'm gonna push it in here and push it in here. Meanwhile, the people over in Europe the foresters in Europe are putting baskets of acorns out for the corvids, and saving thousands of dollars in volunteer time. So these guys are actually our bioengineers because they do this scatter caching or scatter hoarding. And so what they end up doing is they'll take from a patch of suitable habitat and they'll transport it to these different spots. And actually what they found is that the ones that are cached by the corvids, by blue jays and crows and the like, those are the ones that have a higher success rate of turning into seedlings than the ones that just fall to the ground, or that are probably planted by us, right? So, encouraging those, I would love to do this experiment, and maybe I'll find a landowner this year who will be into this, and we can get some cameras to check out what happens. But in working with the animals on the landscape, we can probably help our forests as we move forward. All right, for your reading list, if you haven't read these already, Gifts of the Crow, that one's by John Marsluff and Tony Angel. He's the guys that did the mask study. Mine and the Raven by Bern Heinrich. Winter Raven is also by Bern Heinrich. That's another good one. Anybody got any other good crow books? We're at the library. Okay, those are two really great ones to start with. All right, so let's get you looking more specifically. I find figuring out who's who between crow and raven to be difficult, because they're never like this. They're not sitting right next to each other. It's like Hairy and Downy Woodpecker, right? Until you learn the things that are going to tell you the difference between those two. That's another show. I'm not giving that away right now. We're going to work on these guys, okay? Until you learn the tricks, it's really kind of hard because you never get them lined right up with one another. So there are some things when we put pictures side by side that we can start to look at. I'm going to tell you the things that the books say are good, and then I'm going to tell you the ones I have problems with that the books say. And maybe some of you will have some good tips, because I know there are some really good birders in the room here. So maybe I just need to know a different way to look at it than what the books are telling me. So this is my left. On the left we have the crow, and on the right we have raven. So American crow and common raven. These are the two birds that we have in the corvid family that we consider like the black corvids. That's what they're called by some researchers. And so for us, when we look at these two, size is the thing that comes up a lot. But as a birder, you know that size, you can't always rely on size, especially when they're not standing right next to each other. But crows do tend to be smaller, and they're a little bit more svelte. And ravens tend to be larger, and they're just a little bit more husky when in their stance. Ravens also swagger when they walk. Yes. They got a swagger, and then they got a hop. And crows just hop. So that's kind of fun, too, when you see them on the ground. Some of the other tips are bill size and thickness. And I always have a hard time with this because of my perspective and how I might be looking at the bird. Is the bird above me? I might not have the right angle for the thickness of the bill. But in general, the raven's bill tends to be thicker, and the crow's bill tends to be thinner. I also I've heard some people describe it as the raven looks like it's got a bill that's been just shoved on the side of its face. It doesn't kind of flow with the crow's head, but that doesn't always work depending on how you look at it. The other part that's kind of fun to look at are these little things. These are rictal bristles. They don't show up really great here, but they're on the top part of the bill. And on a raven, they come out halfway or maybe a little bit more. And on a crow, not so much. Okay? Not great if the bird's way up in the air, okay? All right. Then the other place that you want to look at is the throat. This one I like, and I'm learning to look for this. So the feathers on the raven tend to be shaggy. I'm going to try to step out of the way here. So the feathers on the raven's throat tend to be shaggy. They also tend to seem like they fluff that up or have a little bit of a throat pouch, and that shagginess comes out even more. The crow's throat tends to be smoother and doesn't have that puffed up look. Now, after the windstorm in October, you can throw all of that out, right? Because the birds are looking shaggy, they haven't preened yet, so that doesn't always work. But these are like little things that you can start to look at from sitting birds. So let's shift. Anybody have any other things that we could point out in this picture? Don't skip ahead. Yes. Yep.
Is there a blue sheen in the one on the left?
Yeah, and I think that's more about the exposure of the picture. It's really interesting. There was a cool interchange online. I heard some people talking about gulls and going to see the gull at the Waterbury compost pile. Brian Pfeiffer posted a picture of, I can't even remember what kind of gull. Does anybody?
Glaucus.
Glaucus. Okay. So the glaucus, and somebody commented that it looked a little too bright. And they started talking about the film exposure, right? And so you have to take that in mind too when you're looking at pictures, especially that sometimes whatever that wash is or that color that may be standing out might be a result of the light that's available and the film. Anybody else? Yep, Gary.
On the tail,
Ooh, we're not there yet. But yes. Foreshadowing. Yes. Warren.
Crow bills are smaller and proportionally smaller than raven bills relative to the size of their head.
Relative to the size of their head. And that's the same thing that you use for woodpeckers, that same kind of thing. So when we look at birds, one of the things that we can always start to look at as we map the bird's body with our eye is if we start at the bird's head and we look at the bill. And we really look at bill shape and we use that proportion piece to map the bird's bill in our brain so that when we open our field guide, after the bird goes away, by the way, stay with the bird as long as you can, get as much information. You can use that to try to figure out who's who. Okay. Yes, in the front row.
Is there a difference between the way they fly?
Yes, foreshadowing. Next slide. Hold on.
the raven's got a bigger head and bigger body on it than the crow, doesn't it?
It does in this picture, but I could show you a couple other pictures that I could pull off of line where everybody's looking smooth. So it's really hard, right? Every bird is going to be a little bit different. So you just kind of have to prepare yourselves. You have this little toolkit of things to look for, and then you put as much information together as you possibly can. All right, so here's another information piece that people always forget when talking about birds, is am I in the right place for that bird? And we are in the right place for both ravens and crows. So we have common raven on the left, American crow on the right. The red means that it's common in that space when it's breeding. The blue means it's common in the winter. And light blue means that it's uncommon in the winter time. So, right, so we've got the red, kind of the blue, and then the light blue in here. And so we overlap. So here's the other cool thing that I just found fascinating about crows and ravens in Vermont. So if we think about how Vermont has changed since colonization, right? Who was here first? Ravens. So, right? So Vermont used to be mostly forested, right, before colonization, and that's the type of habitat that ravens really like. And as it changed and shifted to agricultural lands, and agricultural lands that were farmed for what? Sheep. Everyone's whispering, be bold, sheep, right? So, farmed for sheep, right? What do ravens do to sheep? They kill them. And what do we do to ravens when they kill our sheep? We killed them. So all of a sudden that population of ravens just went, right? And then who came in? Crows, because they like, right? They like more open land, okay? So generally, when we think of where we can find ravens and crows in Vermont, we think of crows being in habitats where it's a little bit more open, a little bit more agricultural, with maybe like a nice forest patch nearby. And ravens, we tend to think of as being in larger forested blocks and maybe up in the mountains. So here's the crazy thing. It's shifting. So how many of you have helped with the breeding bird survey before? Awesome, yeah. So between the first breeding bird survey and the second breeding bird survey, we've seen the number of ravens breeding in the state increase and grow. And not only has it increased, but they've started to show up in more blocks. And they've showed up in blocks that are in the lowlands now, as well as in the highlands. So they are adapting and changing as well. So it's really kind of neat. I really wanted to pull up some eBird data that was like, hey, look, all the ravens are up here and all the crows are down here. Nope, it's all mixed up now, except for those of us who are misidentifying the crows and the ravens. So. Okay, so let's get back to a couple other things that will help us. This is the flight thing that we were talking about. Okay, so tail. And again, this can be really hard. Go Google pictures of ravens and crows online in flight, and it's really kind of hard. You have to have that right view, which is why it's so important to stay with the bird as long as possible until it goes away and it's gone, so that you can get really good looks at the bird. So a raven will have a little wedge shape to the tail, and a crow has a rounded tail. So here's crow, and here's raven, okay? So the primary feathers on the crow, and some of us call these digits because they look like little fingers, okay? So with a crow, you'll get nice distinct digits, and you'll get 5 of them. You should be able to count to 5. Ravens tend to be 4, that you'll get 4 clear primaries, okay? Some people describe crow wings as being more rounded. Yeah, and in this diagram, I don't really see that. So I have to look at more pictures. That one doesn't really work for me. The digits thing works for me, and trying to look at the tail works for me. And then the other thing that we can start to look at is how does the bird fly? And this was awesome. When we were on Christmas bird count, we watched this. This was great. It was in the woods. We didn't get a good look at the tail, but we saw a flight pattern like that. Much more soaring and less flapping and less linear than a crow tends to be. So those are all our little pieces that we can start to put together for crows. And this young lady has been so patient up here. Yes?
The raven's wingspan is smaller than the crow's.
The raven's wingspan seems to be smaller than the crow's. This is the other thing that I see a lot in the drawings of crows is there's a little bit more of an elbow sometimes. They have a little bit of a hitch right there in their wings, which might make it seem like their wingspan isn't as great as a crow. And of course, if they're, right, one's farther and one's closer, right? If the crow's closer to you and the raven's further away, it might really look like that. So whatever your perspective is and how close they are to you is really going to shift how you look. All right, here's just a couple more. So flapping versus, I did hopping and swagger. Ravens tend to be in pairs or like less than 50, less than 20, right? They don't really hang out in the big murders that we see with crows. So pairs, but never thousands. And then the vocalizations are something that you can start to train your ear for. So you're going to train your eye, and then you're going to train your ear. Does anybody else have some awesome tips for raven and crow differences? Gary?
On when you were showing the tails, the ravens have the V.
Yes.
In the tail. You remember that there's a V in raven.
Ooh, yes. Oh my gosh, I love those little hooks. Good. So V is in raven, and that will help you remember. Because, right, you'll get out in the field and you'll be like, oh man, did she say it was rounded for the raven? And so now we won't do that. All right, Ron? Aerobatics, yes. Who?
Ravens.
Ravens.
They'll do flips, they'll do split S's.
Yeah.
You won't see crows do anything as dramatic as that.
They're not as fancy. And brave. Barrel rolls, misty flips, all that kind of stuff. All right. Anybody else? Yes.
I've noticed that the crow has a beautiful fluid rowing movement when it's flying.
Yes.
And as you say, it doesn't glide as much as the raven. But the raven, when it flies, doesn't lift his wings
As much, as high. So it doesn't have as much of as deep a stroke. Fabulous. I love that. See, and this is what I can't wait for, right? Winter is that time when it's quiet birding, right? And this is something, I have a new program called Slow Birding. It's just about, I'm just going to bird where I'm at. I'm not going to run around. I'm not going to get all anxious and go after everything. Whatever's there in front of me, I'm going to do some deep observation with that. And so these are some of the things that we can do, especially during the winter time, with the Corvid family. All right. Vocalizations. Oh yeah, then there's this guy. Oh, that'll totally mess you up. All right, so here's something that's kind of interesting. This is fish crow. So for the most part, you don't get different species of crows overlapping in the same habitat, okay? And typically it's not more than 2. So you might have 2 that overlap. So here in Vermont, we have 2 species of crow that overlap. Now, the only, as far as we know, and maybe it's different now, so remind me, but Ted Murin found a nesting pair back in the late 90s at Red Rocks. Do we have other nesting pairs in the state. I didn't come up with anything yet.
What are the Hannafords and Burlingtons? No, the hotspots.
Okay, is that top secret? No. All right, Hannafords and Burlington for nesting ravens. I see nods from the back there. Okay, so fish crows tend to be associated with water. And what's really interesting is that they're more of a southern species, and the way that they got here was by following river valleys. And so they were first seen in the Connecticut River Valley, and then kind of made their way over. And so the first documented nesting pair was in Red Rocks. And they're fun. They're fun because they're really hard to tell the difference between an American crow and a fish crow just by looking at them. So you have to listen. All right, let's do that. Okay, so these guys have great vocal chops. All kinds of vocalizations going on. All kinds of things. And one of the things that we tend to do when we break down bird song, and this would be for songbirds, is to listen to all the different voices. And birds typically have 5 different voices. They have 2 songs, one for mating, one for territory. They have a couple of different types of calls, contact calls that are ways to stay in touch with each other, calls that are alarms, they're harsh sounding and they're very loud and short. And then begging calls are a call as well, and that's young begging for food. So if you wrote that down, cross it all out because it doesn't work for corvids. It just doesn't. So you can't really break it down into 5. And crows and ravens are very, very different. And so the best thing I can tell you to start to do is, 1, not only go out and listen yourself, but 2, take some time to visit the Macaulay Library of Sound online and start listening to some of the different vocalizations for ravens and crows, and also look at the sonograms. So sonograms give you the visual of the sound that you're hearing. And some of us are visual learners. So hearing and seeing the visual at the same time will help you cement it in your brain really well. And I have to go back and do that all the time because even though there are great descriptions for what crows and ravens sound like, it doesn't always work for my ears. So I'm going to go back just for a minute. So some of the things that happen with crows, the reason why we can't just break them down into 5 is because they have between 20 and 30 different calls. And there's been all this research over the years, and each scientist has a different way of describing and grouping and categorizing the calls. So no one's agreeing on anything. So there are just 2 ways that we can break those down, and we're gonna do that in just a minute. So oftentimes the other problem with this is that calls are very specific to the individual, sometimes very specific to the family, and sometimes very specific regionally as well. So this is the other place where people like to be like, oh, there goes the crow. So in the morning, I'm like walking my daughter out to the bus at like the crack of dawn. It's still dark out, and the crows are leaving their roost in St. Albans for the morning. And this one is, they fly, they've got that nice, fluid row, and it's going, ah, 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 ah. And of course, I'm like, oh, it's saying good morning and hi to us friends, right? So we need to know what the bird is saying and why the bird is saying that, but it doesn't work that way, and it especially doesn't work that way with corvids. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. And they're mimics, so they like to mimic other birds. They even mimic people sounds, and they're known to mimic owls as well. So some of the things that we have to do is we have to start to fine-tune our ears. And things that we can start to fine-tune our ears for are the duration and the interval of the sound. So how long is the sound, and how far apart are each of those sounds? Do they come quickly together? Are they more spaced out? Okay, so that's something that you can start to listen for. You can listen for a tone. Is it deep or is it more nasal? Okay, so how does that sound come through? And that's the thing on the sonograms. When you start to look at that, you'll see on the sonogram what's more nasal and what is a deeper sound based on the frequency. All right. Here's the other important part, is to watch what's going on around you. So this is where you combine what you're hearing with what you're seeing. So in the morning, that crow that was leaving okay, has a certain pattern that it calls. And I'm so curious, and I can't wait to go out to the bus stop tomorrow morning now and maybe record those sounds. And if I could get them in a sonogram, then I can start to like look a little bit at that sound for that particular behavior and where that bird is. So I know it's leaving the roost, and I know it's flying in a loose stream with other birds. So they're all leaving, and they're coming from the south where the roost is. They're going north, and there's this cawing that happens. It's not all of them, it's one, and they might pop up in a pine tree and stop, and then keep going, okay? So here's the two ways that we can categorize that. Now I've got to categorize it in two different ways. So is it a structured call? And this is why I want to record it. Is it the same type of call each time in that same place? Does it have a structure to it? Does it have a pattern to it? Or is it unstructured, where it's kind of all over the place and it's for a very specific context, okay? So structured and unstructured calls. The unstructured calls that have a very specific context, that would be something like an intense alarm call or a fight between birds. All right. This is where it gets fun. Okay. So now we get to play crow or raven. Are you ready? Yeah. Okay, so let me make sure the sound level is up. And the speakers are in the back, so get ready. Okay. All right. So think of all those things. That nasal, the pattern close together or far apart. Okay, ready for the next one? This is the same. It's the same bird. No, I shouldn't have said same bird. Same species, different individual. Ooh. All right, ready? Last one. You got it? Crow. You think crow. Okay, so now comes the tricky part. Why do you think crow?
Because it was like, I've heard a crow and it's like,
All right. It's like, rah, rah, rah. Okay, so you just found the pattern, the duration. It's fairly short, right? Ah, ah, ah. And they come close together. And it's higher pitched, right? You got it. So that's crow. Good job. Very good. Okay, so you have that in your, I know, yes, all right. Woo! What's your name?
Lila.
Lila, good job, Lila. All right. Okay, next one. You have that in your head? I know, wow, right? I'm going to work on my crow calls and my, what's this one, do you think? The other one, yeah. All right, let's listen. One more. One more fun. The knocking. Ooh, raven's knock. I love that. Can you do it? You can do that. Raven can too. Pretty cool. All right, so you got raven. So lower, right? And the duration of the call is longer. It lasts longer, so it kind of gets held out. So some people like to describe crow as a caw and a raven is a croak. No. Caw and a rock. Rock. That's what I think, right? So give yourself permission to change it. If the book says it's whatever it is, croak, and you don't like it, think of what you're hearing in your head and change it. So croak has never worked for me. So I do. Who just did that? Whoa, whoa, whoa! Can you do that again? Awesome. That's really good. In the back of your throat. Good stuff. That's awesome. All right. So now I want you to listen to this one. And this one. Two parts, really nasally, right? And the other one was just a much more like nasally, beepy sounding. So who's that? Fish crow. Okay, so this one time I was at a crow roost in Burlington, and I didn't have fish crow on my life list. And I was so excited because I had gotten out of a meeting and I'm following the streaming crows. And I'm like, I'm going to go find where they're roosting. This is going to be awesome. And I get out of the car and it's like beautiful along the edge of the lake. And I'm standing there and I'm listening. And gosh, I really hope this works. So all the cawing, and then the I was like, yes, fish crow! My friend! Woo! I was so excited, and I was all by myself. And I was like, woo! Of course. But I know, right? No one's going to believe me. I got it on video, though. So when you start to fine-tune your ears to those simple things and create handles for yourself that are going to work to identify that bird, then you're prepared when you go out and you listen. So that usual sound, like you said, and is it Lila?
Yeah.
Lila said, I know crow. And so if you know crow, then you're going to know what's not crow, okay? And you've got two other options now. You got raven and you got fish crow. Yeah?
I'm wondering if the begging young, are they sometimes like more nasally and...
Yes. Awesome. Do you have babies in your house? It's possible. Yeah, so the young ones tend to be more high-pitched, right? More intense. And that's pretty true for most begging calls of birds. A little bit more higher-pitched and more intense. Okay, I know we're coming up on an hour and it's hot in here. But I've got one more part to share with you. And I'm going to tell you, you guys, people were contacting me before I even came down here to tell me about the roost here. And I would love to get it on the map. And so I want to show you this so that you know how to get it on the map, okay? So this is the Crows in Vermont project. I started this a couple years back because during the winter, all of a sudden I get bombarded with these emails. Bridget, what is going on with the crows? There's this huge murder outside my house. It's 4 o'clock, I'm in the office building, and there's like crows just streaming by. It's like a river. What is happening every year? Every year. And I was like, okay, so we're going to figure this out together. And I knew about this project called the Seattle Crow Project, which is from those folks over on the other coast in Washington who were using Twitter to get sightings of crows. And basically what they did is they created this algorithm that if you tweeted something about a crow and you attached a picture to it and you put the hashtag Seattle Crows, it would automatically take that and put it on a map. Okay, so it's really, really cool stuff. And that was like more than 10 years ago. Now we have this really great thing where we can use iNaturalist to do that. And so the Crows in Vermont project is online, and it's a way for us to kind of look at and answer some of these questions that all of you probably have about roosts. What's up with the streaming? Why are they all coming from one direction? Do they stream out in the morning? Why are they like so loud and then all of a sudden they're so quiet? Why are there 50 of them and then all of a sudden they take off and leave, they go someplace else and that's where everybody else is? What's going on with that? How come they're in my backyard roosting and then a week later they're not? They've moved someplace else. Where's someplace else? Okay? So some of the research that's already been done about crow roosts, tells us that this is a winter phenomenon, although crows do roost together year-round. It just tends to be in larger numbers during the wintertime, and they're still trying to figure out the whys. So there's a bunch of different theories about it. With ravens, they know that it is very social because in the wintertime they are sharing information about where carcasses are. So they get together at the end of the day and they're sharing information. It's really hard to think, although they haven't proved it scientifically yet, that crows aren't doing the same thing. So it's very likely that crows are doing the same thing when they roost. The number one reason that crows all hang out together during the wintertime is to avoid predators, like great horned owls and barred owls, except for the one that got taken out in my backyard last year. And my 5-year-old daughter comes running into the house with a handful of crow feathers. Mama, look! And I was like, what? And we went out in the yard, and there's blood splattered all over the snow, and guts hanging from the fence. And we were all like, yes, this is the best mystery ever. And so we took pictures of it, and we're thinking about what could have happened, and we're having a really fun time imagining all this stuff. And so we decided that it was likely the great horned owl that lives in the cemetery in the city that came over and took out one, right? But that's what the idea is with a roost. With all coming together, if we're all together, it's going to be harder, right? It's going to be harder for that owl to, well, be successful, and only one of us is going to get it. So if there's 5,000 of us, that's pretty good odds, okay? Especially if you're in the middle of the tree and not out on the edges. Later on in the spring, when the snow melted away, we found owl pellets under the tree. So it kind of confirmed our suspicions, which was really, really cool. So they come in to avoid predators. There's also been some research that's been done about thermoregulation. So you think about it, how many of you are feeling hot right now? Yeah, there's a lot of us in this room, right? Same kind of thing when you're all in a tree together, you're going to be giving off heat. The other thing that comes into play with thermoregulation is a lot of times those winter roosts are in cities. They are in urban areas. And so the other thing that's giving off heat are the buildings and the pavement and all of that. So you can stay warmer that way. There's also some thought that it's about socializing, finding a mate, sharing information about food sources, just having a good time together before you all go out the next day and try to make your way to survive. So here are some of the things that you can watch for. So typically I go out at the end of the day, which is great. If my kids are at an after-school program, I'll leave around 4 and start making the loops to pick everybody up. And that's right around when they're starting to move. And all of a sudden the crows start to stream. So you see these rivers of crows kind of moving across the sky. Sometimes they're really consistent streams. Sometimes they're more sporadic, okay? So you want to follow those, okay? So we get to around 4:30, 5 o'clock when it's starting to get dark. And the next thing that they're going to do is they're going to stage. So they're going to find a spot where they can all come together. And this is where it gets loud, right? So you got that one crow that's up on the top and he's going, ah, 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 and he's bouncing, right? They're doing that too. So there's some physical behaviors that we can look for as well with some of these calls that can give us the context for what might be happening. So the staging area is where everybody kind of comes in. And this is when all the swirling happens, right? So all of a sudden somebody spooks that one and they go up and around and they come back to that spot. And they start collecting in the trees around that area. And then every once in a while they'll pick up and they'll move, right? So they're not done yet, but as it gets darker and darker, they're going to move toward wherever the roost is that they have chosen. Who knows how they do that, right? Who chooses where the roost is going to be for the night? But you guys probably know there's some spots around the city that they like, right? Okay? And they might stay in that one place and go to that one place over and over again. For a while in St. Albans, it was my backyard. We have a nice acre patch of forest with all the landowners that are right on the outskirts of town, and there's a stream that runs through it. And so they would roost there at night, and it was awesome. And they're not there this year. They're someplace else. Okay? So streaming, staging, and then the roosting spot, and when the sky goes to that inky blue-black, yes, right? You have to be out there for this. It's amazing, right? Raucous. Okay, this is where we do a little vocalization together. Let's do raucous staging crows together. And then when I go like this, that means the sky has gotten blue-black and we're all going to stop. Are you ready? All right. I kid you not. It's like it gets to that certain time when the sky gets that color and they're like, shh, go to sleep. If you don't, the owl's going to find us. Shh. It's really amazing. And then it gets so dark that you can't count them anymore. So, a great thing to do at the end of the day. My kids are 6, 5, and 4. We drive all over the place. What are you doing, Mom? I'm going to find the crows. Come on. Look out the window. One night we found them staging above the funeral parlor in town. That was pretty funny. So those are some of the things you can watch for and the things that you can report to iNaturalist. So you can go online and you can create yourself an account. And it's not hard to identify a crow. You guys all know how to do it now. And I'll take a raven too in there if we get that. That's all right. But it's going to be pretty obvious because it's going to be hundreds of them or thousands of them. I counted 5,000 in Taylor Park one night in St. Albans. It was pretty cool. And you can put your observations online, and what's great is they show up on a map. So here's St. Albans, where I live. Here's Burlington. Some folks have put some points there. And here's Middlebury. Let's zoom in on whoops. Oh, did I zoom in on Middlebury? Oh, my animation didn't work. Okay, so you're going to have to zoom in on Middlebury. There's really only 3 or 4 points there. There's not a lot for this year. And Warren King was telling me that the crows have kind of moved where they've been roosting. And they've done the same thing in St. Albans. And that's part of the fun of this. This is really just for fun and for information. I think maybe somebody might be interested in it in terms of research someday, but not at this point. It's just kind of for us to answer those quizzical questions that we have. Where are they? Where are they roosting? Where are they staging? The gray dots are other reports of crows, I believe. I'm not quite sure. Or they're older sightings that aren't within 30 days. The red is within 30 days, and the blue is more than 30 days, and I think this year. If I have that right. All right. Counting crows.
Yes.
Right? So how would we count people in this room? Right? We could sit there and I could go 1, 2, 3, right? That would take me forever. But I know that this is about a row of 10. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And you got to keep counting by tens. So 110. Yeah, right? Give or take. Okay? So one of the ways that we can do that is visually, you count a set of 10, and then you try to apply that across the top of the tree. Okay? One of the things I've learned is if you start counting in tens and then 5 birds fly by, you don't go 110, 115. So I would up that to 120. I stay within the tens. Okay? Yes. Yeah. All right. It's going to snow again, you know. So I hope tonight you've grabbed onto some things that will give you an opportunity to experience winter in a different way this year. And maybe slow you down and get you looking at those birds that are so common that we see every day, but are just so very amazing. Like I said, you can find me at birddiva.com anytime. I do walks for the public. I do walks for landowners. I help landowners look at their property and figure out what can I do that's going to be good for birds and other wildlife. I will answer your questions. I will laugh with you about your silly crow stories, whatever you got. So please reach out, and I want to thank you all for coming tonight and enjoying crows and ravens. So I I guess we have time for questions, if you have any. We'll take a few. Yep.
How are the ravens killing the sheep if they can't eat the animals?
Yeah, so, right? So they weren't as much, right? So the amount of killing that was happening wasn't as much as what the farmers thought. And mostly it happened with the babies that were, the young that were being born, right? And you're born outside and there's all that stuff that comes with it, right? So it's that piece. Yep. Other questions? Yes?
Do ravens and crows, is there any record of them interbreeding?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I don't know that one. Fish crow. Gary.
Do they travel in family groups?
Yeah, so this is another interesting thing. So one of the reasons why roosts work really well during the wintertime is everybody is kind of disbanded. And there's some research that's going on right now. So ravens tend to stick together, right? And when they're in their winter roost. So there are like family groups in the winter roost. They're not sure about it with crows. Crows do that co-breeding or co-parenting, where a crow from 1 year's brood will stay and stick around and help later on. They're still, so part of what they're trying to figure out is what happens in terms of cohesion within the winter roost, and they're not sure yet. What they have observed is that when the birds come in, they're not necessarily in family units, but when they go out, they tend to be in specific groups or like flocks. So I'm so curious because every morning there is between 7 and 10 crows that come from that the industrial complex at the southern end of the city in St. Albans, and they're flying north, and they're doing the same thing, and they have this set of pine trees that they stop in, and one stops and calls, and then there's like just a couple more that kind of come through, and they all leave and they go toward the hills outside the city to the north. I would love to get bands on those birds and see if they're the same ones every day. Not with a mask on though, because I don't want the mobbing and the stuff afterwards. So much to be known. Like, this is the crazy thing. You start digging into this, and we know little bits and pieces, but we still don't know a lot about corvids. There's a lot out there still.
I've observed, I have a raven here near our house that we've been observing until one of them died, but was killed on the road. But we've had a couple of times late summer raven roosts, like I've counted 30 or 40.
Wow.
And they, just like the crows, they come in all from the same direction toward dawn, and when it's dark, they go quiet. Quiet. And they stay for like 10 days. So with ravens, the other thing that's interesting with ravens is, so a pair will set up a territory, which remains year-round, right? But if a set of juveniles can overwhelm that pair, then they'll be able to stay in that territory. Then they become a social group that communicate with each other about food sources. But that's a large group of ravens. That's pretty cool. Awesome. Very exciting. Yeah, good. You emailed me, didn't you? I did. Yay. She and I have been telling stories this week already. It's been really cool. Yeah.
What do crows and blue jays have in common that makes them both corvids?
Oh, now you're getting into the science. Anybody got that one? I would have to like dig through like the phylogenetic tree to try to figure that one out.
I think blue jays have similar vocalizations, very varied, very specific calling in other blue jays. So I got food.
Yeah, that intelligence thing is.
So they have a behavior that's very similar. They have physical
attributes too. Yep.
Smart like crows.
Smart like crows. Yep. That same thing. So similar, and they mimic too, right? They mimic hawks a lot in order to distract and then take advantage of food, right? That I always watch that in my backyard. I have a small Westie, and one crow will come in and start to like caw at my dog, and I swear they're like trying to get him away from the dog food that's outside. And I'm like, you're gonna go for that, aren't you? I haven't seen it yet. I haven't caught it yet. Yep.
There are so many Native American stories about Raven.
Yes.
As Raven.
Mm-hmm.
And Raven sometimes gets away with it and
Right.
sometimes doesn't, but most often he gets off. We went on a trip up to Alaska, and one of the crew would lecture us on Raven, and I've read them because I read mysteries.
Yes, yep.
Ravens and mysteries, but they must have all of the information that we know now.
Mm-hmm.
Must have been gathered by the peoples before us.
Right, the native peoples. So if you look into some of the work that's been done by John Young, he's a tracker that studied with Tom Brown. And so he teaches about bird language. And it comes from how native peoples, he went and studied with native peoples in Africa, and watched how connected they are with birds on the landscape. Because birds, that alarm call can tell you a lot about what's going on. And if you're in Africa and the birds start alarming, that might tell you that there's a predator nearby that could be a threat to you. So we do see deep, deep stories in native people's cultures about crows, ravens, and a lot of the other mimics, right? Because those are the birds that are out there that are the sentinels in the woodlands that are telling you things with their voices and with their bodies, that if you slow down, slow burning, and you watch, you will have the opportunity to see those. So for example, in my yard, I have nesting Carolina wrens, and I do a sit spot every morning during the spring and summer and into the fall. I just sit in my backyard with my notebook and I listen to the usual suspects, and I watch their body language, and I've really gotten to know the Carolina wrens. And so one day we're in the backyard and my kids are jumping in the trampoline, and the Carolina wren is doing its normal twittering thing, and then it goes into an alarm call. Harsh, quick, sharp. And I look up from what I'm doing, and in my neighbor's yard, across the brook, there's a fox working the edge of the forest line. And the Carolina wren told everybody that that was happening. And the only reason why I knew to do that, to stop, is because I knew what the alarm sounded like. And I knew to slow down and just listen to what's right there in my yard. And I got to see a fox in the city. That was so cool. All right. I will stick around and answer questions. My business card, I think, is still on that table right there. So grab one on your way out. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you.